A sharp creak split the silence, and Aleric jerked awake, heart hammering. The cabin door swung inward on its broken hinge, scraping loudly against the warped floorboards. Cold air rushed in, cutting through the stale dampness inside. His body, sluggish from sleep and pain, fought to respond, but he managed to push himself upright against the hearth, blinking into the sudden gray-lit mist. For a moment he saw nothing but the swirling fog and the dark smear of trees beyond the doorway. Then a shape moved, stepping into the threshold. Aleric's hands scrambled instinctively for anything he could use as a weapon. A broken chair leg, a stone, even the brittle scraps of kindling at his feet. But his fingers closed on nothing useful. The figure took another step closer. It was not a soldier, not a bounty hunter, not a mage. It was an old woman. She moved with slow, deliberate steps, a long patchwork cloak trailing behind her, her bare feet silent on the wood. Her hair hung loose in silver tangles, and her face was lined deep with age, though her posture was straight as a blade. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The woman simply studied him, head tilted slightly, as if examining a curious piece of wreckage washed up by the tide. Aleric shifted his weight carefully, pressing his back harder against the cold stone of the hearth. His muscles protested, tight and bruised, but he forced himself upright enough to face her. The woman did not move. Finally, when the silence had stretched thin enough to snap, she spoke.
"You look like a half-drowned kitten,"
she said, voice low and dry. Aleric blinked, disoriented by the casualness of it. She took another step into the cabin, the mist curling around her ankles. Her gaze flicked to the remnants of the failed fire near his feet, then back to his face.
"No strength left then,"
she said, almost to herself. He found his voice, rough and cracked from disuse. "Who are you?" The old woman smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes.
"Someone who has lived long enough to know better than to leave a boy to die in the woods."
Aleric tightened his fists against the floor, wary. The world tilted slightly around the edges of his vision, exhaustion pulling at him again. He hated how weak he felt, hated how she could see it so easily. "What do you want?" he rasped. She raised an eyebrow at him.
"Even if I did want something, you don't seem to have much."
She crossed the cabin without asking permission, crouching near the hearth. Her hands moved with careful precision, gathering the driest scraps of wood left in the corners. She produced a small bundle from within her patchwork cloak. It was a twist of oiled cloth, pressed tight, and set it into the heart of the cold ashes. Aleric watched, tense and silent, as she struck a flint against the hearthstone. Sparks flared once, twice, then caught. A small fire struggled to life between them, casting flickering shadows across the ruined walls. The woman sat back on her heels, studying the flame as if it might say something important. Her face, in the unsteady light, looked carved from the same rough stone as the hearth itself, hard, weathered, and impossible to read.
"You are lucky, boy,"
she said after a long moment, her voice as thin as smoke. Aleric said nothing. He watched the fire instead, the way the tiny flames fought the damp air, stubborn and slow. The old woman chuckled softly, the sound brittle as dry leaves. Aleric shifted again, every motion dragging a line of fire through his battered muscles. The warmth of the new fire seeped slowly into the cabin, but it did little to ease the gnawing ache in his chest or the tight knot of suspicion coiled in his gut. He watched her warily. There was no tremor in her hands, no hesitation in her movements. Not the carelessness of a fool, but the calm of someone who knew she had nothing to fear. Aleric felt it like a pressure against his ribs, but she simply sat there, arms resting loosely on her knees, as if they were two travelers sharing a campfire rather than strangers in a wreck of a cabin in the middle of nowhere. The silence pressed in again, heavier now, filled with things unsaid. Finally she spoke, her voice a rasp against the low crackle of the fire.
"You're running."
She said, not as a question but a statement of fact. Aleric stiffened. She glanced at him sidelong, the faintest hint of amusement crossing her weathered face.
"No shame in it. Running's just surviving in a straight line."
He didn't answer. His throat was too dry, and even if it hadn't been, he wasn't sure what he would say. The old woman stirred the fire with a broken bit of wood, sending a small cloud of sparks tumbling upward. Her hands, he noticed, were scarred. Not the soft, knotted scars of illness or idle accidents, but the rough, deliberate scars of someone who had fought and bled.
"You've got too much weight on you, boy,"
she said, not looking at him.
"It drags you down, makes you easy to catch."
Aleric clenched his jaw. "I can handle myself." The old woman snorted.
"You're handling yourself right into a shallow grave."
He flushed with anger, but the fire crackled louder, swallowing his retort. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered. Finally, she turned to face him fully, and for the first time he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not pity or amusement, but something colder. It made the small cabin feel smaller, the walls leaning inward around the guttering fire.
"You won't last long like this,"
she said, voice steady and unsympathetic.
"Out here, weakness draws worse things than men."
Aleric narrowed his eyes, forcing himself not to flinch. "You here to finish the job, then?" The old woman snorted.
"If I wanted you dead, boy, I'd have let the cold and the crows do it."
She stood, slow and deliberate, her shadow stretching across the floorboards. Aleric noticed then how little she seemed to feel the cold. No shiver, no tension. As if the mist and the night were familiar companions.
"You've two choices,"
she said, glancing toward the broken door where the fog writhed.
"Stay here and rot, or stand up and see if your legs still work."
He hesitated. Every muscle protested, every breath strained, but he braced a hand against the hearth and shoved himself upright. His knees almost buckled. The old woman made no move to help him, turning away.
"Good enough,"
she muttered, turning away. Without another word, she stepped out into the mist, her patchwork cloak trailing behind like a fading memory. Aleric stood there for a long moment, the fire crackling weakly at his back, the chill creeping back in around his ankles. Then he followed her into the gray. The fog closed in thick around him, cold and wet against his skin. He could barely make out the shifting shape of the old woman ahead, little more than a blur in the gray. Aleric stumbled after her, each step jarring through his battered body. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, broken roots, slick mud, unseen dips waiting to catch him. His breath came harsh and ragged in the dense air. The woman moved steadily, never once looking back. They walked for what felt like hours, or maybe only minutes. Time twisted strangely in the mist, stretching and folding until Aleric's mind felt just as unmoored as his body. Just when he thought his legs would give out, the ground sloped sharply upward. The old woman climbed it easily, her bare feet silent on the damp earth. Aleric gritted his teeth and followed, slipping more than once, catching himself on thorny undergrowth. At the top of the rise, she finally stopped. The mist thinned slightly, revealing a broken stone wall half sunken into the earth, swallowed by moss and creeping vines. Beyond it stood the crumbling remains of an old watchtower, its top sheared clean off by some long-forgotten force. Only jagged teeth of stone remained, pointing up into the gray like the ribs of some dead thing. The woman turned, studying him with the same distant patience she had shown the fire.
"You'll shelter here tonight,"
she said. He glanced at the broken ruin, the gaping hole where a doorway must have once stood. The inside was little better, open to the elements, with only a few half-intact sections of wall offering any real protection. Still, it was more shelter than he'd had in days. Aleric staggered forward, making it 3 steps before his knees gave out. He dropped heavily onto the damp ground, the shock of it driving the breath from his lungs. The woman watched, unmoving.
"Good.
She said after a moment.
Better to fall here than out there."
She stepped lightly over the crumbled stones and disappeared into the shadows of the ruin. Aleric lay there, fighting the urge to simply close his eyes and let the gray mist take him. Above him, the broken ribs of the tower clawed at the sky. The old woman crouched near a corner where 2 sections of the collapsed wall still leaned against each other, forming a kind of narrow pocket. She was arranging a crude nest of broken branches and sodden leaves, scraping away the worst of the mud with her hands.
"You'll want the wall at your back,"
she said without looking up.
"Nothing good comes from sleeping in the open."
Aleric didn't need telling twice. He hauled himself into the shelter, curling his bruised body against the damp stones. They leached the little warmth he had left, but at least they blocked the worst of the wind. The woman finished her work, then sat across from him, setting the small bundle she had carried beneath her cloak onto the ground between them. She untied it with quick, practiced movements. Inside were a few miserable supplies, a length of dried meat, a crumbling heel of bread, a stub of tallow candle, and a battered water skin. Without ceremony, she tore the meat in half and tossed a piece to him. Aleric caught it weakly, nearly fumbling it into the mud. He hesitated for a moment, then bit into it. It was tough as old leather, but food was food. His stomach cramped painfully at the first swallow. The old woman chewed her share slowly, eyes half-lidded against the mist that still pressed around them. For a long time they ate in silence. When the meat was gone, she leaned back against the stones, tucking her knees up under her cloak. The mist shifted outside, and for a moment Aleric thought he saw movement, something pale and slow, dragging itself along the edge of the ruin. He blinked, and it was gone. He wiped a hand across his face, pushing the damp hair from his forehead. He was seeing ghosts now. The fog and hunger were playing tricks on him. Still, he found himself pressing closer to the wall, heart ticking faster. The old woman watched him quietly.
"You'll learn to tell the real ones from the mist,"
she said. Aleric wanted to ask her how she knew so much, who she was, why she had helped him. But the words tangled in his throat, heavy and sharp-edged. Instead, he rested his head against the cold stone and closed his eyes. The last thing he heard before sleep dragged him under was her voice, low and rough, and almost kind.
"Rest while you can, boy. Tomorrow will be worse."